A man chooses, a slave obeys.
Welcome to the Ethics in Video Games podcast, where we explore issues at the intersection of ethics and video games.
What follows is a series of graphic, interactive scenes that we can't show you.
Hello, everybody. Our guest today is Benjamin J. Chica. He's a lecturer of philosophy and religious studies at Curry College. His work connects classical American pragmatism, process theology, and ground up being theology. And yes, we're talking about theology today. The current focus of his works touches upon media criticism and popular culture, which has led to him speaking in front of audience of video games fans more often than fellow academics in recent years. Playing as Others, Theology and Ethical Responsibility in Video Games, which came out last year, is his book on how moves towards greater diversity and inclusion in video game industry can inform theological ethics and conversations about diversity and pluralism. And that's what we're talking about today. Ben Chica, welcome to the show. Yay!
Thank you for having me. Thanks for the invite. I'm happy to be here.
All right, so Ben, religion and video games are two terms that you rarely hear together. Well, you might actually hear them fairly commonly together, but the rest of us don't, right? Can you tell us a little bit the type of investigation religious scholars have done about video games? Like, what have people been talking about when it comes to the intersection of religion and video games?
Sure. There's a reason you don't hear it much. My publisher is relatively sure this book of mine is the first of its kind. So,
well, yay!
It is breaking new ground in some way. But there has been some work done on religion and video games. I have to be honest and say that it was kind of embarrassing initially. It was a bunch of academics who don't play games just getting used to actually playing them. So there's really tenuous connections like, well, I guess people who are really struggling to, say, control Link in Legend of Zelda. A lot of early scholars kind of just played the big hit popular games. And there was tenuous connections like, well, I have to control this character's movement in the world. I guess it's like performing movements in religious rituals. Accomplishing a quest is like an uplifting experience that might be like the uplifting experience somebody might find in their religious beliefs. They were kind of grasping at straws.
Right.
They quickly started getting better. MMOs like World of Warcraft and Second Life were really popular to look at because in the game players can chat about real world events. So like sociologists of religion could really easily apply their methods to just like when players talk about religion in the chat features in these games, that's something they could study. So like, how are they discussing religion in the game world? So that was a big part of some early work. I think the groundbreaking moment for religious studies and video games was this book by Rachel Wagner called Godwired. And in that, she wrote about how the way culture develops around video games is similar to the way religions develop. And Godwired is similar to an argument that some scientists studying religion have made, like that we're like homo religiosus, that our species has to create meaning in some way. And the way that video game culture can like really, really get into the video games and love them. And then the way forums develop online and people chat about the games outside of video games and end up, cosplaying as characters is the way that people get really, really devoted to a religion in some ways. So thus the Godwired is a play on the technological aspect of video games, but also that we're kind of wired for finding meaning in some way, even if it's not a world religious tradition, but there's a lot of meaning that people find in taking part in video game communities. So that's kind of like a big, large-scale overview of, I think, the development of what people have looked at.
Right.
Interesting. I'm surprised that nobody's looked at, because the first thing I thought about was spaces in video games that are meant to be religious spaces. or ruins of religious spaces. Like there's plenty of places that particularly in the 3D games where you're meant to go in and feel awed by the space, like going into a church or going into a chapel or going into a temple of some sort.
There was I'm quickly doing a search as I think about your question, see if I can find it because I don't have it. There we go. Frank Bozeman wrote a book called Gaming and the Divine. So his book is the closest thing to doing something like mine did, in that he's a Catholic theologian. I'm not Catholic, but he is as opposed to just a scholar that's studying religion, he's actually a theologian invested in a tradition, and that book kind of does explicitly what you said. It's a look at just, he's very concerned about, he's kind of a traditional Catholic. He's not like on the, like any fringes trying to push it to be more like liberal or conservative. He's pretty like a standard Catholic theologian. And he's looking at any doctrines that can be illuminated in video games. And he's very interested in explicit depictions of religion in video games. For good and for bad, he's interested in like, and it's not just video games that do this. Like heavy metal music uses a lot of religious imagery, and a lot of like first-person shooters. I'm thinking of games like Painkiller, often have religious imagery, and it's just kind of the aesthetic that those games borrowed from heavy metal as well. So that has been done. So I think thank you for the question. It reminded me of his book.
No, it's great. That's great.
Are there games that you know of where people get a sort of spiritual feeling from? That where playing the game is a sort of spiritual activity, because this idea that we are naturally drawn to find meaning, to create meaning in things. Given how many people spend so much of their lives in games, you would think that something like this, does happen. Do you know of any kind of occasions where there are kind of, people get part of their spirituality from the game, spiritual inspiration, let's say, from a game?
So it's an interesting question. In a way, it's like the theme of the entire book. That this can happen, even in games that you may not think it would happen in, and it may not look like religion to you, but from a certain way of thinking about religion, like functionally, like something like ultimately important is happening there. So that's a very vague answer. Like, what on earth did that mean? So I'm going to give a specific example, and then more generically describe what I've seen going on in video games. So this is an odd case because of the way this collaboration happened, but That Dragon Cancer was a game about two Christians whose son Joel died by age 4 of pediatric cancer. And they teamed up with video game developers, and they basically functioned as the lead designers with an actual video game designer, and kind of merged their ideas. And the game is about their experience, but also because it's a video game and in this imaginary world, also kind of what they imagined and hoped for their son Joel. Since they're Christians, they believe in heaven and an afterlife. And in the video game, they could imagine him still flourishing and living and being a happy child. And the game was actually part of them grieving and getting through the experience, and kind of having that hope that there's maybe something more for their son still, even though he died at age 4. And the game has since been used in pastoral counseling classes in seminaries to teach students. This is a really good example of a scenario that you might have to help someone go through if you're a pastor and you are counseling them going through a grieving process. And we're going to play the game in class because actually experiencing it as opposed to talking about it will be better for you than just me standing up here as the professor telling you how to help people going through death. And
that's super cool.
Yeah.
I mean, that game is such a raw. I don't know if either of you have played it, but it's such a raw, like outpouring of emotion.
Yeah,
yeah.
It's not a fun game to play in some ways. It's Go ahead.
I played it when my son was 6 months old, and it was
Oof.
Oh,
hard.
wow.
It was beautifully done. And but I was just, it was so hard for me as a father to play and think about my baby boy while their baby boy is dying, and and I think it's a great example, Ben. Like, really, like, there's Jesus is I think there's even a scene where the son goes to heaven, right?
Yeah.
Right near the end.
Mhm.
But yeah, that's a really great example. Okay, so let me let me ask you this. So you've played video games for all your life. I know this because I've heard you talk about it in another podcast. Do you have any thoughts about the ethics of presenting religions or religious themes in games?
I think generically, like taking a lot of RPGs take very general, like vague inspiration from religions, where like in most RPGs, if you go to a healer, it's a religious figure. It's like often depicted with a
Right.
cross. So any of the classic, like Nintendo, Super Nintendo RPGs, the healer will often be in what looks like a standard kind of Christian church. And there'll be a cross, and that's where you go to get healed. And they kind of took the notion that religions are here to help people in some way. So nondescript religion is where you go to get healed, get your party healed in the game.
Right, and I think that comes also from the classic cleric class in D&D too, which is
Right.
the
That's-
Oh, sure,
religious
sure.
class, and that's the healer of the party. So
I think where games can get into trouble is inaccurate representation is a big part of how real world oppression happens. You misrepresent a group of people, you then pretend that's normal. You can then reject them or like mistreat them when they actually try and correct that, and because the reaction is like, no, not that's not the way things are. Like your entire group is this way, and then you kind of discard them and push them aside because this is treated like actually the way things are. So misrepresentation is important societally that way. They, like misrepresentation in movies and TV shows isn't just like an oops like mistake. It actually does matter in some way.
yeah,
So like I think of I have an issue with so the new game just came out. I have an issue with Horizon Zero Dawn and Horizon Forbidden West because it's a fake religion in the game, but they're basically presenting these characters that you play as Aloy, and you're interacting with people that are kind of being presented as Native Americans because there's this post-apocalyptic world, and people have kind of gone back to nature, and it's kind of a really simplified stereotype of Native American religion that they're just kind of worshiping the sun and went back to like they're simple people who have to go back to the land because society is over, and it doesn't
Right.
it doesn't acknowledge that Native Americans have complex culture, and their religion, like it doesn't acknowledge that it contains actual wisdom. Like there's a lot of genuine knowledge of plants and animals in Native American religion because they understand their intimate connection to those things. It's not just going back to nature and loving the sun or something like that. So there's a problem. There's a
Right.
problematic. It's not explicitly saying it's Native American religion, but it's kind of pretty clear what they're taking inspiration from there. It's not helped by the fact that Aloy is a white woman with dreadlocks in the game, and that's its own sort of problematic depiction
Right.
of characters in
Right.
video games. I even have
And-
a similar critique of the God of War video games, even though it's the Greek gods and all of those myths. It's just such a simplification that in those games, Kratos is just angry, and has to fight and kill all the gods. But it's such a simplification of the actual Greek myths that the gods loved intervening with human affairs, and they were all fighting with one another, that they actually could have been accurately depicted, and then Kratos would have had a reason to actually be angry and fighting them. You could have still had the just violent God of War gameplay, but they didn't even represent the myths like well enough. It actually could have been better without having to be like a different sort of game. God of War could have still been God of War, and it could have been all about action and fighting, but they kind of leveled the playing field and simplified it in a way, which is its own sort of, even though nobody's actively practicing devotion to Zeus and the Greek gods, it is its own sort of like cultural wisdom, and like those stories are still used in philosophy classes to talk about the points about life that they were meant to convey. So that's its own way of getting religion wrong in games.
You know,
Right.
I actually, yeah, Andy, you guys should have done better with God of War.
Yeah, I know it. I worked on God of War 2 and a little bit on 3.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm thinking of how much when I think of the Greek myth, and the Greek myths have been used so much in games and so much in everywhere else. How
yeah.
much sometimes I think that the religion has been reduced to the myths. Where it's hard to understand what the Greek religion was like. I like that in playing Assassin's Creed Odyssey, it gave you a lot more of an idea of, and I don't know how accurate it was, but an idea of, here's the Temple of Apollo, here are the people who are actually working at the temple, and you can talk to them and get more of an idea of what it is that they're doing, what the worship is like. That at least went beyond the simple fact that the simple mythology. Okay, so Ben, we've been talking about ethics for 40. This is the Ethics of Video Games podcast, so let's move on to ethics. We've been talking about ethics for 40 episodes. The word God hasn't come up at all this entire time. We've mentioned philosophical theories every once in a while, but usually we really stick to the everyday language of ethics, right? The one that most of us discuss, and the one that really is what usually comes to place when we do applied ethics. In what ways do religious ethics take a different sort of approach, or maybe a different focus in the way that they would investigate ethics in video games?
So I think the simplest contrast to answer the question is philosophers who deal with ethics would use reason to try and figure out what's right and wrong, and that's where you get all the different philosophical theories. And if you take a philosophy class, you're going to be told about utilitarian ethics and Kant's duty-based ethics and Aristotle and virtue ethics, and they're all trying to just apply reason, which is what philosophers do, to figure out what's right and wrong, and how they do that in different ways. The contrast would be in religious ethics. God's involved in figuring out what's right and wrong. So, different religions have different beliefs about basically ultimate reality. So, even in Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism, they don't have a god per se, but just like in Christianity, Judaism, Islam, like God is the most ultimate reality, and that's kind of an age-old philosophical question as well. Before those religions developed, philosophers pondered, what is there a most ultimate something?
Right.
Plotinus had an answer to that, and it wasn't a being like us. So there's kind of personal answers to that question. There's non-personal answers. And from that can flow a list of instructions on how we're supposed to behave in light of that reality. So it would just basically be a kind of straightforward secular use of reason, or a belief about God, that some of those what to do's and what not to do's, where they come from. Religion and ethics, I think they can come up in relation to video games in two different ways. So a religious studies scholar would kind of look at a religion and what they believe and then how they act, and they would kind of just study it like as a detached scholar gaining information. So they would look at things like there's a few books about this. There's a couple, I didn't mention them in my kind of earlier vague history of the field, but a few Christians have written books. They're on the conservative and liberal side of basically, here's a list of my beliefs. I'm just concerned basically about how video games will impact them. So one book written by a conservative Christian was basically just looking at video games to see, are they depicting issues that might conflict with my beliefs, and like thus could they drive people to be more like violent, or he was against gay marriage, which is still being debated in some Christian churches. So he was just concerned about will games depict LGBTQ plus characters? A more liberal Christian wrote a similar book, but was just concerned about will technology. The book was about technology in general, and will video games as a piece of technology just kind of hinder mature development of people, like the way people develop? It wasn't about video games per se. So that's just kind of, you could look at a list of do's and don'ts, and conservative and liberal religious people, that will be their ethical guidance, and they'll disagree on that. And they could just look at video games and look for places of conflict. I myself am even the title of the book, Theology and Ethical Responsibility in Video Games. I do write as a theologian who is actually concerned about the direction religions take, and I have like a stance on it. So like I'm developing this as like, this is the way you should be thinking about ultimate matters. And Paul Tillich, who's a figure in the book, is actually closer to Taoism and Confucianism and some Eastern ways of thinking, because he's not a supernatural thinker about ultimate reality. He's closer to more ancient philosophers that didn't think God was a person that was doing stuff for us. It's a very traditional.
That's sort of a deist sort of thought, right?
It could be. It's a good first reaction, Andy, to what I said. A deist would say there's like an ultimate God that maybe sets things in motion, but then doesn't do anything. So the founding fathers of the United States were, frankly, most of them deists. For Tillich, and the ancient philosophers, they would identify God with being itself. So like the most ultimate reality is being itself, not a specific being. So God can't be a being because God is being itself, basically that which explains all the beings that are around us. So we're beings, our microphones are beings, just stuff that exists.
Right.
For Tillich and for the Taoists and even for Confucians, they would disagree on specifics, but generically what flows from that is things like the essence of who we're supposed to be is never somewhere else. So it's not like there's a supernatural realm where God is, and like that's where our essence is. Being itself is with us here right now. So Tillich calls God the ground of being. And Shlomo, what you were saying about Taoism, it's kind of the way is with us, and we just need to follow it. What flows from that is one way of thinking about religious ethics is instructions for conduct, but another component that I wanted to kind of get out and hopefully make clear is that what those beliefs do for us. So when you feel like society's keeping you down or you're being mistreated, you can at least have a personal confidence in Tillich's way of thinking, and even in the Taoist example that you were giving. That is with you right now, and if you're being mistreated for whatever reason in society, like, you know who you are, and you have the confidence that like society should be treating you differently, and a real sort of ethical, like meaningful personal courage that allows you to like continue on in the face of that struggle results from that belief. So there's that angle of religious ethics as well, kind of like what the beliefs actually do for you and mean for you, not just a list of instructions they give for conducting yourself in society.
So if I could bring that into sort of the game world, basically, are we talking about like if we talk about the character that lives in the game world, let's say Link, in Legend of Zelda, the game world itself in through this lens is the god. So the game itself is this idea of God, and he lives within this world, and the world has rules, and the world rewards you for doing certain things and punishes you for doing other things. And the better you know how this world works, the more tied you are to this God. Is that kind of the way to think about that?
Kind of. I actually think Tillich. Paul Tillich was writing in the wake of World War I and World War II. He couldn't have imagined the technology in the video games that we have now, but I think he would have kind of been okay with that. He developed what he called a theology of culture, So literally this point about God giving you personal courage and like the ability to go on is a revelation in the sense that you might forget about it, but it's a revelation that can happen literally anywhere. And he actually thought it was more likely to happen outside of the churches because the churches often separate themselves from the concerns of actual everyday people and are off doing their own thing. And he was especially critical of churches that behave that way because German churches did next to nothing to try and stop Hitler's rise to power. So he really meant that culture might actually manifest this point better than an explicitly religious institution. But for him, it's still religion because it makes this point, it can make this point clear to people. So he actually engaged with a lot of art in his day, and he even spoke at an opening of a new wing of an art gallery in New York. I'm blanking on which one at the moment. He loved expressionist and impressionist paintings because they can kind of snap you out of the sense that because they're twisting and distorting images, so a starry night is not just a starry night, it's this bizarre twisting of the images that kind of conveys that there's more going on there. He thought art could snap people out of the sense that this is just beautiful or this is just fun, and actually realize that there's more depth to meaning there. And essentially, I'm doing Tyllich's project in relation to video games, and I think it works in something like this is how it works. I make a big deal out of the video game Gone Home in chapter 4 of the book, which is kind of just like a case study of these ideas in action. So in Gone Home, you're playing as Katie Breyer, who's coming home from an overseas trip, and you're basically figuring out what happened to your family while you were away. And you just, in a first-person view, explore the house, and you find out that your sister Sam kind of came out in high school, and she's in love with another girl, and the parents are kind of not okay with it. It seems like they have some religious like hang-ups about it. And at the very end of the game, you're not sure what's going to happen. It's been out for a number of years, so do I have to do a spoiler alert? Can I spoil the ending for everybody?
It's fine.
Yeah,
All
feel
right.
free.
Sam and her girlfriend Lonnie run away. They don't need saving. They just need to like let people be themselves. And it's kind of some people got tricked into thinking you might have to help Sam at the end of the game because there's a bathtub in one room of the house. And there's red all over it, and it kind of looks like blood, so you might be worried if she was self-harming or might actually be dead at this point. There's an audio log that plays, and if you don't catch it, you wouldn't know, and you could think it was blood, but they were dyeing each other's hair one day, so it's red hair dye. But you go up into the attic, and the happy ending is that they're together again, and they're happy, and everything's fine. For, say... a lesbian in high school, which is what the characters in the game are, if you're facing discrimination, playing that game could really be like a life-changing experience because like they're being seen at least by the game. And for players who maybe who are against gay rights in general, maybe like Christians who side against that issue, they might have their position changed and actually have their ethical behavior transformed by the video game. And there's actually been reporting that has happened about the game Gone Home. Gita Jackson, when she was working for Kotaku, actually asked people to give her stories about has a game ever changed your opinion, and she actually got some conservative Christians who responded that Gone Home actually made them switch their stance on gay rights.
Excellent. Which would be surprising considering media does this all the time, right? I mean, this is the Will and Grace effect and all that, and I'm glad video games are in there as well. So how does this fit in, let's say, with the ideas of Paul Tyllich?
Tyllich thinks two things should happen when you kind of figure out what he means by God. You should get personal courage out of an encounter with God. And an encounter in God is kind of just what I said, like realizing God is not a supernatural being somewhere else, but is kind of with you always and with everyone else always. first you get a sense of personal courage if whatever isn't going right in your life. So if you feel like mistreated by society, if you feel like an essential part of who you are is maybe being an artist, but artists aren't compensated very well financially in many ways. So maybe you being you isn't the easiest thing. You can at least get a sense of personal courage and just like perseverance, which is often what religion has meant to people through the years. I'm teaching a course on race and religion in America right now. And a lot of slaves were forced to convert to Christianity, but a lot of them genuinely believed it. And it was a means of persevering through the way they were absolutely just abused and mistreated as human beings. So like that theme of perseverance should come through. But once you realize that point for yourself, you should also realize it's a point for everybody else too. Like this realization can happen for everybody, and this sense of worth. So for Tyllich, he was really, really concerned about inclusive societies. So the consequence in the ethical point for Tyllich is you should immediately become more open-minded and accepting and not behave in ways that would restrict this experience from happening for other people. So Gone Home is a really great example of that, because I know, because of Gita Jackson's reporting, that it's actually happened, and it's not just a nice theory that I've taken from Paul Tyllich and applied to video games. People have actually had the aha moment of, oh, like I can't prevent, in the case of that game, I can't prevent LGBTQ plus people from also kind of living their lives fully and being embraced by society. I have that experience, and they can have it too. So he had hard to understand words for it, and he talked about heteronomy and autonomy basically being polarized situations where groups try and restrict who counts in society, and then autonomy, like asserting my own individual freedom if I'm not included, is kind of the reaction, and now you have a polarized situation. Theonomy was his word for what should happen if people get the ethical thrust of his argument, which is simply now a new inclusive whole, where you realize you can be a Christian and you can also be LGBTQ plus. In the case of Gone Home, I know that's actually happened. So That's how they actually play out in real life, and that's how Gone Home is actually realized his point. So it's not just Paul Tyllich was a very abstract thinker. I also tend to be quite abstract, but there's a specific practical payoff, and it is a payoff in terms of how we treat one another. So it is ethics from a very kind of abstract metaphysical point.
Right. It feels like there might be a danger of learning the wrong lesson in a game, like getting, because games can present a world in which the rules can be whatever the game designer wants them to be, and so the rules of a world could be that. So actually, there was an interesting thing I read about yesterday. It had to do with comparing. This was early 2000s, so it would have been EverQuest and Ultima Online, where Ultima and the comparison was, it was a simple rule that got switched. Was in Ultima Online, it was okay to kill other players, like you could kill other players and take their stuff, and in EverQuest you could not. And the lesson learned for the players in Ultima Online was to fear other players, stay clear of all other players as much as possible. Because you didn't know what they were going to be like. And in EverQuest, then you had, because you couldn't kill people, banded up, and people had social interactions and had all this other stuff. And so, and that ultimately, from in MMO space, that social stuff ended up being a better way to go, and the current crop of games have leaned into it. But certainly, people could have learned the wrong lesson from Ultima Online, right?
But the point is, right, that if a framework like Tyllich's will give you a way of understanding, is this the wrong lesson or not? Is that the idea?
Yeah, I think both of you are correct. Tyllich would turn a critical eye to games that maybe are learning the wrong lesson. Like Tyllich was turning a critical eye to the failings of his home country of Germany. Tyllich was also, the way I've described religious or theological ethics, as you could look at kind of instructions for behavior that come from their beliefs, but there's also the kind of personal sense of what the beliefs do for you that I'm describing, like personal meaning, like it's kind of inside of you, you know, that's a more like risky business endeavor because you don't know what lesson people are going to take away. But Tillich was open to the power of culture, and it could go badly, but it could go really well. But he was more interested in that than the churches that were just separating themselves from art. And I'm more interested in, investing myself in video game culture. Both of us are more interested in that than just a settled list of do's and don'ts. We're much more interested in frankly, the risky business of taking culture seriously and not dictating to it. Like these are my beliefs. So those are the books I referenced earlier. Like there was, I'm forgetting the name of the author, but there was a conservative Christian who wrote a book about video games, and he was just going through a big list of games and saying whether they conflicted with what, conservative Christians on his account are supposed to believe. I'm much more interested in seeing the power of culture and the way it's actually making society more inclusive, like Tillich thought culture had the power to do. And I just have to be open to the fact that the power of culture can go in lots of directions, and I will turn my critical, philosophical, theological eye to it. And like Shlomo said, Tillich has the power to criticize it, but I'm fully aware, and Tillich was fully aware, even though he didn't know video games, just the power of culture in general can obviously go opposite of the very inclusive opening way that Tillich thought it could.
Right. Have you seen ways that the video games have affected culture at this point? Could you point to specific things and say culture is going this way because of video games?
I mean, the obvious thing would be to point to, in terms of your question about learning the wrong lesson. I mean, culture was impacted in the form of Gamergate, and then a lot of people who have been trying to drive polarized in-group, out-group tension have actually explicitly pointed to, I learned these lessons from Gamergate. Right. So Milos Yiannopoulos, who was working for Breitbart and kind of driving some of the right versus left partisan politics when Trump was running for president, he specifically credited Gamergate for sharpening his chops on how to drive this wedge between people in a way that actually got him his job at Breitbart. But in the same way, those who were targeted in Gamergate and those who supported them, instead of accepting being pushed out and attacked to the margins, they've just gotten louder and louder and kind of refused to go away like Gamergate wanted them to. And now at huge video game conventions like PAX, so I'm speaking to you just outside of Boston, and at PAX East, after Gamergate, they introduced the Diversity Lounge, which was controversial at first because it was poorly placed in the convention center because it was literally a room in the corner the way it was laid out. So it's like you're putting diversity in the corner and just putting the people there. But the room has gotten better, and now it's a genuine safe space. You can learn about and support LGBTQ plus businesses. You can hear about what Black developers are actually up to. So it's a safe space. Plus you can actually show active support to businesses that are helping people who have kind of been attacked in the industry in the past. They now have the Take This away from keyboard rooms, the AFK room. So Take This was a charity that was started after a member of the games press committed suicide out of depression, and none of their colleagues knew. It's now another safe place staffed by professional clinicians and volunteers. So again, if the negative aspect of video game culture shows up at PAX, you can go there and it's a very quiet, relaxing room, and you can actually talk to professionals. And then just more and more games like the sorts I've been talking about exist now, and I've encountered tons of developers making them for the explicit purpose of telling their stories that didn't exist. Do either of you know the game 1979 Revolution Black Friday?
I've heard of it, but I haven't looked at it.
So I met the developer at PAX East in 2016, I want to say. And his name's Naveed Konsari, and he's an Iranian-born game developer, and he explicitly made his development studio to tell underrepresented cultural histories. And it's just a great game about something that a lot of people don't know about, but is a major historical event in the world, which is the Iranian Revolution. It's set in what was actually going on, and it does something that the video game historically has not been great at, which is the representation of Muslims. In a lot of first-person shooters, historically, you can bet that everybody brown and black that you see on the screen is going to be a terrorist trying to kill you.
Right.
You actually perform a call to prayer and go through the steps of prayer accurately in the video game, and you actually hear a player say Allah Akbar during a prayer instead of while they're trying to kill you. And it's just, it's a wonderful, it's something simple as that can really be transformative of, oh, like even a simple lesson, but like, oh, Muslims are people. They're not just terrorists. I forgot because in my day-to-day life, I encounter lots of stereotypes about them. And a game like that could have a little aha moment for a player. And that really interests me.
Yeah, that's great.
Ben, the other thinker that you make a lot of use of is the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas. What's special about his approach, and why is it not enough on its own? Why do you need, let's say, Paul Tyllich as well? How did these two mix for you?
So in a way, Levinas was obvious to go to, and I think the marriage of the two of them, it seemed obvious to me, even though it might be controversial to some. And this is how it played out. Levinas was similarly interested in an inclusive society. Like both him and Tillich are thinking they were both abstract philosophers. Tillich was Christian, Levinas was a Jew, and they're actually both reacting to World War II. Levinas was captured and sent to a military prisoner of war camp, but his entire family was killed in the Holocaust in a concentration camp. For similar reasons, they're both trying to react to the failures to come up with an argument about how a more inclusive, accepting society could be reached. And the most basic point in Levinas's philosophy is the face of the other. And the face of the other is just literally their otherness, and he refers to it as their face, and that you encounter the face of the other. And he means it to be this strange, abstract-sounding phrase because before you actually know any information about them, so whether they are rich, poor, black, white, literally before you actually encounter their face, what the face represents is an ethical calling to be treated fairly and be heard and be helped when in need. And he did literally mean it in terms of like, don't kill me, like don't harm me in any way, because he was thinking of what happened during the Holocaust and to his family. And the point is, before you lump a bunch of factual information onto this person, so I've now seen their face, I know that they're black, I know they're short, I had a little conversation, and now I know that they're poor. Before you actually amass information about anybody, everybody is the other to one another, and everybody expresses this basic ethical calling for fair treatment and respect. The problem is when we kind of get into our in-group, out-group, groups. So I'm here with people like me. We all count to one another, and we kind of treat each other fairly. But we don't even recognize that we're forgetting about this more basic point, and we do actually reject others because they're not like the people in this group. So society pretty easily gets organized in a way where that doesn't happen. Interesting thing about, for me, so video games, because you have to interact with them instead of reading just a book about the other. In video games, because you have to interact with them and actually interact with characters, can actually let you encounter the face of the other in a way that you don't get in just reading about it. So for me, then I get a nice little Tillich's Theology of Culture, Levinas's encounter of the other. Video games are a piece of culture. You encounter the face of the other in them, and then these kind of two thoughts come together. And coincidentally, they're both concerned about a more inclusive society. So games like Gone Home, games like 1979 Revolution, you get Tillich's Theology of Culture in action. And in the games, you have encounters with the other, like Levinas was talking about.
Which is interesting because the other here is a constructed other. right? I mean, it's an NPC, right? You're essentially put into the world where the designer essentially creates this other for you to face with. What about encountering other players, right? As in a game, can you get a similar sort of experience from that?
I think you can. It's actually a note I took down from another conversation I had. I hadn't thought about that point too much. It's more like it's something to think about in like follow up work that I do on video games. I think. I mean, the obvious answer is yes. The difference is that, granted, AI can react in different ways to a character, but when you encounter an NPC, there is a constructed story and some script that you're going to encounter. Another player can obviously react in many different ways and has more options available on how they're going to interact with you, so you don't know which direction that encounter is going to go in. But I don't think it's different in kind, really, because like video games also, even when they're programmed versus a player that can react in any way, like they do push back, just like another player is going to push back and you can't do anything you want with them. Video games push back in subtle ways. I think of Papers, Please is another game that I make a big deal of in the book. And the entire game pushes back on the player wanting to do maybe anything they want. Because if you just played the game by the book, like by the rules, so in the game you're basically processing paperwork at a border crossing, and you're more or less doing information matching. You're just inspecting documents, and you get paid if you do that correctly, and you get docked pay if you make mistakes. But they have Lucas Pope, who made the game, has the characters that are crossing the border tell like ethically gripping stories about. Please don't let the man behind me in. He's trying to sell me into sexual slavery, and I'll face almost certain death eventually. I'm trying to smuggle in medicine for a loved one who's dying, and the medicine isn't available in this country. So you need to let me smuggle this in. And the game, it's a video game. It lets the player choose whatever they want to do. And you can play however you want, but the game as a whole is kind of pushing back, just like a human being might push back and say, like, do you really want to process their paperwork correctly, or do you want to let the woman through and turn away the guy that she's claiming is threatening her life?
Right.
That sort of pushback that you can't do whatever you want, is not unlike a human being will push back and say you can't do whatever you want to me. So,
right, and it's interesting in this case, right? We often think of immigrants, right, as the other. We often think of them as a, certainly conservative depiction, sometimes as this invading horde, right, that's coming. And here you're getting all these kind of particular quandaries of the difficulties of being in the position that someone could be as an immigrant, right, that the game will put you face to face with. And just how complicated it is to decide who gets to get in and who doesn't.
Yeah, the game does a great job of like showing the complexity of the situation, because the player has a family too, and if you get your pay docked, your family can get sick and they can die too. So it shows concern for everybody and the complexity of the situation, because like it's easy to vilify, say, Border Patrol officers if you're for immigrants' rights, but they also have families that matter, and their job happens to be enforcing a rule. So like, do they get to do a poor job and get fired? But then what do they do? So it doesn't have an easy answer, but life often doesn't either. So
that's right.
Right.
Let me ask one, Andy, unless you have one. I was going to ask one final
No,
question.
go for it. Go for it.
So Ben, let me ask one final question. Having said all this, are there any lessons you think, let's say, video game developers could take from this in terms of how they design these kind of encounters that we have in video games?
For developers, I guess I would want them to be aware of the power of video games, that it's not just like a fun diversion. They can actually be like genuinely life-changing. I think of during the pandemic, Rami Ismail, who's a independent game developer, he put together a Animal Crossing island for Muslims to gather to break the fast during Ramadan. And think about being, say, a Muslim in a city in America where there's few to no other Muslims, and probably certainly not somewhere where you can actually go, practice, pray with others. Like, that virtual environment was probably a better experience than their real life breaking of the fast, because they actually got to genuinely share a space, even though it's virtual, whereas they would have been alone in real life.
Right.
So I would say be aware of the power of games and just what they can actually do. And even if they are fun and just like a goofy time, like Animal Crossing is not a particular serious game, with like one like little idea about it, it could become really powerful and meaningful for people. And something else that I say is just experiment with interesting small ideas and learn from just trying something new that indie games have been trying. I mean, I've been a gamer my whole life. I love big franchises. So I'm not saying all developers leave the big giants and go make indie games, but pay attention to what's going on and maybe push for some experimentation in your big studio.
All right, great. Benjamin Chica, thank you so much for joining us today. Good podcast. Play nice, everybody. You can subscribe and listen to all of our episodes wherever you listen to podcasts.